train choked out a dying breath of coal smoke, leaving Beatrice stranded on a platform that smelled of horse piss and sun-baked dust. She was 300 pounds of mail-order mistake, clutching a crushed velvet carpet bag. Then, a grubby hand tugged her heavy wool skirt. "You my new mama?" The 310 to Denver screamed down the tracks, shrinking into a dark, metallic speck against the flat, glaring horizon. Silence settled over the Bitter Creek station, heavy and oppressive, broken only by the dry rattle of wind through the sagebrush. Beatrice stood on the warpboard platform, a solitary, massive figure in a sea of empty scrubland. The heat was a physical weight. It pressed down on the dark broadcloth of her traveling suit, baking the heavy fabric until she felt she might combust. Sweat pooled beneath her breasts and trickled down the tight, unforgiving corset gripping her ribcage. Her thighs, rubbed raw from 3 days of jostling in a second-class railcar, burned with every microscopic shift of her weight. She gripped the handle of her carpet bag until her knuckles strained white against the leather. There was no one waiting. Beatrice dragged her eyes across the depot. A rusted tin sign banged against a wooden post. A stray dog scratched at its fleas beneath a water trough coated in green slime. The station master, a skeletal man with a face like cured leather, hadn't even looked up from his ledger when she disembarked. He certainly wasn't looking at her now. She walked toward the lone bench against the station wall. Her boots crunched against the grit on the floorboards. When she sat, the weathered wood groaned loudly under her 300 pounds. She froze, a flush of hot humiliation prickling the back of her neck. Even here, at the edge of nowhere, her body was an apology she was forced to make. She eased her weight back, breathing shallowly through her nose to avoid the worst of the station's stench. A potent cocktail of hot iron, sulfur, and stagnant manure. In her deep pocket, her fingers found the folded edges of the letter. She didn't need to read it. The words were burned into her mind in his jagged, careless scrawl. Caleb Miller. He had promised to be here at noon. It was now 4:30. The sun was beginning its slow bleed toward the jagged teeth of the western mountains, casting long, mocking shadows across the dirt. A bitter laugh scraped the back of her dry throat. What had she expected? Romance? A savior? She was a 28-year-old seamstress from Chicago who ate her loneliness in buttered rolls and sugared almonds. She knew exactly what the men in her boarding house called her behind her back. Caleb Miller hadn't wanted a bride. He had wanted a draft horse. And yet, she had packed her few earthly belongings, desperate enough to believe that the frontier might not care about the size of her waist. She thought of the mirror in her old cramped room, the soft, pale expanse of her stomach, the heavy, dimpled arms. She had bet her life that a mountain man wouldn't care. He had taken one look at her from a distance, she decided, and simply ridden away. The urge to weep rose in her chest, tight and acidic, but Beatrice swallowed it down. Crying took energy, and she had none to spare. She opened her carpet bag, fingers brushing past cheap cotton shifts and spools of thread, searching for a handkerchief. "You're taking up the whole bench." Beatrice flinched, snapping the bag shut. Standing not 3 feet away was a child. He was perhaps 7 years old, though he looked small enough to be 5. His hair was a matted bird's nest of dull brown, sticking up in greasy tufts. He wore a faded flannel shirt that hung off his bony shoulders like a sack, and his trousers were rolled up at the cuffs, revealing ankles caked in a thick crust of gray dirt. He smelled sharply of wet ashes, old sweat, and something feral. She blinked, wiping a bead of sweat from her upper lip. "Excuse me?" The boy pointed a finger, topped with a black crescent of dirt, at the wooden slats beside her. Said, "You're taking up the whole bench. I was going to sit." Beatrice stared at him. The sheer audacity of the creature momentarily eclipsed her misery. She shifted her bulk slightly to the left, the bench protesting loudly. "There. Sit." He didn't move. His eyes, a startling pale ice-water blue, tracked slowly from the scuffed toes of her boots, up the vast expanse of her skirt, stopping at her flushed, round face. He tilted his head. "Are you Beatrice?" The name sounded strange in the dry western air. "I am." The boy let out a short, puffing breath through his nose. Pa said you'd be big. Didn't say you'd be a giant. The words struck her like a physical blow, right in the softest part of her ribs. A hot spike of defensive anger flared in her chest, burning away the exhaustion. She gripped her carpetbag, leaning forward, her voice dropping to a harsh, trembling whisper. "Who is your father, you filthy little menace?" "Caleb Miller," the boy said, entirely unbothered by her tone. He stepped closer, close enough that she could see the dried mucus on his upper lip. He reached out, his grubby hand grabbing the heavy wool of her skirt, giving it a sharp tug. "You my new mama?" Beatrice stared at the small hand clutching her dress. Caleb had never mentioned a child, not once in 5 months of letters. Need a wife, got a cabin, can provide. Lies of omission. She looked at the boy, at the hollows beneath his cheekbones, the desperate, unblinking intensity in his pale eyes. He wasn't asking for a mother. He was asking for survival. "I am nobody's mama," Beatrice said, her voice cracking. "But if your father is Caleb Miller, you are going to take me to him right this instant." The wagon didn't have springs. It was little more than a collection of splintered planks balanced precariously over an iron axle, pulled by a mule that looked half dead. Every rock, rut, and dried mud hole they hit sent a jarring, bone-rattling shockwave straight up Beatrice's spine. She clung to the wooden seat, her knuckles white, trying desperately to shift her 300 pounds to minimize the impact. It was useless. Her body was a heavy, fluid thing, and the harsh terrain punished every ounce of it. Samuel, he had mumbled his name shortly after leaving the depot, sat beside her, handling the leather reins with a casual, practiced indifference. He hadn't spoken since they left town. The flat scrubland had given way to steep, pine-choked foothills. The air here was different. The baking heat of the plains bled away, replaced by a sharp, biting chill that smelled intensely of evergreen sap, crushed granite, and damp earth. Beatrice shivered, wrapping her arms around her thick middle. Her broadcloth suit, a furnace an hour ago, now felt entirely inadequate. She breathed through her mouth, the altitude, making her lungs work twice as hard. Her chest heaved with the effort, her breath coming in shallow, wheezing rasps. "You sound like our old hound when he got the lung rot," Samuel noted, not looking away from the mule's twitching ears. "Thank you for the observation," Beatrice snapped, tasting copper and dust on her tongue. "How much farther?" "Just past the ridge." They crested a steep, rocky incline, the mule blowing hard, its hooves slipping on loose shale. Beatrice closed her eyes, dizzy from the thin air, and the terrifying drop-off to her right. When she opened them, the wagon was rolling into a small, shadowed clearing carved out of the dense spruce forest. It wasn't a home. It was a shelter. The cabin was a low, squat structure of unpeeled logs chinked with gray mud. The roof was dirt, sprouting patches of pale, sickly weeds. A rusted iron stovepipe jutted from the top, leaking a thin stream of gray smoke into the darkening sky. Off to the side, a dilapidated lean-to served as a stable. But what caught Beatrice's attention, what made her stomach violently hollow out, was the heavy wooden crossbeam lashed between 2 massive pines in the front yard. Hanging by its hind legs from the beam was a deer, its belly slit open from groin to throat. The wet, coppery stench of blood and open viscera hit her like a wall. Standing beneath the carcass, his arms elbow-deep in the animal's cavity, was a man. Samuel hauled back on the reins. "Whoa, Barnaby, we're here, Pa." The man didn't flinch. He slowly withdrew his hands from the deer, a wet, sickening schluck echoing in the quiet clearing. He turned around, wiping a long, bone-handled hunting knife against the thigh of his buckskin trousers. Beatrice forgot to breathe. Caleb Miller was massive, though not in the way she was. He was built like the trees around him, thick, deeply rooted, and entirely unyielding. His shoulders strained against a canvas shirt that was stiff with old grease and dark, oxidized stains. A thick, untamed beard swallowed the lower half of his face, making it impossible to read his expression. Above the beard, his eyes were the exact, terrifying, ice-water blue as Samuel's. A jagged white scar cut through his left eyebrow, disappearing into his hairline. He looked at the wagon. He looked at Samuel. Then, his gaze locked onto Beatrice. The silence that followed was agonizing. It wasn't the romantic, breathless silence of a novel. It was the heavy, assessing silence of a livestock auction. Beatrice sat frozen on the hard wagon seat, acutely aware of the space she occupied. She felt the heavy roll of her stomach resting against her lap, the sheer width of her hips pressing against the wooden rail. She saw Caleb's eyes track her dimensions. He didn't blink. He just stared. Say it, she thought, her heart hammering a dull, bruised rhythm against her sternum. Tell me I'm too fat. Tell me I'm a joke. Tell me to turn this wagon around. The rejection was already swelling in her throat, a familiar, choking friend. She began to calculate how long it would take to walk back to Bitter Creek, knowing she would likely die of exposure halfway down the mountain. Caleb stepped forward. His boots crunched heavily on the pine needles. He smelled overpowering a violently masculine combination of raw meat, stale wood smoke, pine pitch, and unwashed wool. He stopped beside the wagon wheel. "You didn't come to the station," Beatrice said. Her voice was meant to be sharp, a demand for an apology, but it came out as a raspy, exhausted croak. Caleb looked at her flushed, sweat-streaked face. "Axel broke on the good wagon," he said. His voice was a deep, gravelly rumble, unused to soft volumes. He didn't sound apologetic. He sounded like a man stating the weather. "Sent the boy with the cart. You could have mentioned the boy in your letters." Caleb broke her gaze, looking toward the hanging deer. "Didn't seem to matter. You needed a roof. I needed someone to cook and mend. The boy don't change the terms." He reached up, offering a massive, blood-stained hand to help her down. The fingers were thick as sausages, the knuckles scarred and calloused. Beatrice looked at the hand. The dried blood flaking on his skin turned her stomach. She ignored it, grabbing the rough wood of the wagon frame instead. It took an agonizing, graceless minute for her to lower her heavy body over the wheel. Her knees shrieked in protest as her boots hit the dirt, threatening to buckle. She swayed, her lungs burning, catching herself against the rough, splintering side of the cart. Caleb hadn't moved. He watched her struggle with the detached curiosity of a man watching a strange animal navigate a trap. "I need water," Beatrice gasped, her pride entirely abandoned in the face of her failing body. Caleb stared at her a second longer, the muscle in his jaw ticking beneath his beard. Then, he turned sharply. "Sam, fetch the woman. A tin from the barrel. Show her the stove." He walked back to the deer, picked up his knife, and drove it back into the meat. Beatrice closed her eyes, listening to the wet tear of flesh, wondering if she had just traded a quiet, lonely death in Chicago for a brutal, bloody one in the mountains. The inside of the cabin was worse than the outside. It was a single dim room that smelled fiercely of rancid tallow, damp earth, and the sharp, sour tang of unwashed men. The only light bled through two small windows, their glass thick with a crust of greasy dust. In the corner sat a bed frame, strung with sagging rope, topped with a mattress ticking that looked suspiciously stained. A crude wooden table dominated the center of the floor, covered in a chaotic pile of rusted traps, leather straps, and empty tin cans. Beatrice stood in the doorway, the handle of her carpet bag biting into her palm. Her massive thighs burned, trembling under the weight of her body and the brutal climb up the mountain. Every instinct screamed at her to sink to the dirt floor and weep until she had no moisture left in her body. She wanted the familiar, humiliating comfort of her tiny room in Chicago. She wanted a buttered roll. She wanted to disappear. "Stove's over there," Samuel said. He had followed her inside, holding a battered tin cup. Water sloshed over the rim, dripping onto his filthy boots. He held it out. Beatrice took the cup. Her fingers brushed his, and she felt the coarse, dry grime coating his skin. The water tasted strongly of iron and old wood, but it was freezing cold. She drank it in 3 desperate, gulping swallows, the chill hitting her empty stomach like a stone. She handed the cup back, wiping her mouth with the back of her wrist. She turned her attention to the cast iron stove. It was a massive, hulking black beast that dominated the far wall. The iron was caked in layers of spilled grease, burnt flour, and ash. A pile of split pine logs sat haphazardly to the side. Above the stove, a few rough-hewn shelves held heavy iron skillets, a sack of flour, a jar of salt, and a crock of what looked like hardened lard. "Does he expect a meal tonight?" Beatrice asked, her voice sounding thin and ragged in the dead air of the cabin. Samuel shrugged, a sharp, bony movement of his shoulders. "Usually just eats jerky, or roasts a chunk of whatever he killed." The boy stared at her wide hips, then up to her face. "You gonna cook?" The exhaustion was a physical weight pressing down on her spine, but beneath it, a tiny, hot ember of spite flared to life. Caleb Miller had looked at her like a broken plow horse. He thought she was useless. He thought her fat made her weak. "I am going to cook," Beatrice said. She didn't take off her heavy broadcloth jacket. The air in the cabin was too cold, seeping through the gaps in the chinking. She dropped her carpet bag onto the only chair in the room, a sturdy, crude thing made of thick branches, and walked to the stove. It took her 20 minutes to figure out the draft and get a fire catching in the belly of the iron beast. Her knees screamed as she knelt on the dirt floor to feed the kindling. By the time the flames took hold, sweat was sliding down her temples, mixing with the dust on her cheeks. She found a rag that was only marginally cleaner than the stove itself, dipped it in the water bucket, and began furiously scrubbing the cast iron top. The smell of burning grease filled the cabin, thick and suffocating, but she didn't stop. She scrubbed until her thick arms ached and her knuckles were raw. Samuel didn't leave. He stood in the corner, watching her work with the silent, unblinking intensity of a starved owl. She found a slab of salt pork in a tin box, hacking off thick slices with a dull knife she found on the table. She threw them into a heavy skillet. The fat began to render immediately, snapping and hissing in the quiet room. The smell was aggressively savory, making her stomach twist in a violent, hollow cramp. She mixed cornmeal, water, and a scoop of the hardened lard in a wooden bowl, her thick fingers kneading the stiff dough, punishing it. When Caleb finally ducked through the low doorway an hour later, the cabin was changed. The rusted traps and leather straps had been shoved to the far end of the table. In their place sat 2 tin plates. The air was thick with the heavy, rich scent of fried salt pork and skillet-baked cornbread. He stopped just inside the door. He had washed his hands and arms at the pump outside. His skin was red and scrubbed clean, though a faint rim of blood still darkened his fingernails. He looked at the stove, radiating heat. He looked at the table. Then he looked at Beatrice. She stood by the stove, her face flushed, dark crimson from the heat, her chest heaving slightly. She had removed her jacket, standing only in her white cotton blouse and heavy dark skirt. The blouse clung to her damp skin, emphasizing the thick rolls of her waist, the heavy curve of her breasts. She didn't cross her arms to hide herself. She stared back at him, her chin tipped up in bruised defiance. "Food is hot," she said flatly. Caleb didn't say a word. He walked to the table, pulled out the heavy branch chair, and sat down. Samuel scrambled to the other side, standing beside the table, since there was no third chair. Beatrice brought the skillet over, using the rag to protect her hand. She doled out the dark, crispy pork and the dense yellow wedges of cornbread. Then, she walked back to the stove, took a small piece of bread for herself, and stood in the shadows. Caleb picked up his fork. He paused, looking over his shoulder at her. "You ain't sitting?" "There's no chair," she pointed out, her tone dripping with quiet acid. "And I imagine you don't like to watch a woman my size eat." The cabin went dead silent. Samuel stopped chewing, a piece of cornbread halfway to his mouth. Caleb Miller put his fork down. The metal clattered loudly against the tin plate. He turned fully around in his chair, his massive frame shifting, his ice-water eyes locking onto hers. He didn't look angry. He looked entirely, profoundly serious. "I don't give a damn about your size," Caleb said, his voice a low, rough rumble that vibrated against the logs. "I give a damn that you're standing in the cold corner of my cabin after cooking my food. Fetch that overturned crate by the door. Sit down. Eat." Beatrice swallowed hard. the sharp retort dying on her tongue. She dragged the heavy wooden crate to the table, her legs shaking. She sat down, acutely aware of the space she took up, the way her thighs spilled over the edges of the box. Caleb didn't stare. He simply picked up his fork and began to eat, his jaw working rhythmically, devouring the meal with the silent, efficient brutality of a wolf. For the first time since she boarded the train in Chicago, Beatrice felt the tight, suffocating band of shame around her chest loosen, just a fraction of an inch. Winter didn't arrive in the mountains. It slammed into them like a physical assault. By late November, the world outside was a blinding, hostile expanse of white. Wind shrieked through the spruce branches, rattling the mud, chinking and forcing the cold through every microscopic crack. Beatrice had adapted, though not with grace. Her hands were permanently chapped, her knuckles cracked and bleeding from hauling frozen water and scrubbing rough wool. The dynamics in the cabin had settled into a gruff, functional silence. Caleb hunted and chopped wood. Beatrice cooked and kept the suffocating dirt at bay. Samuel hovered between them, a feral shadow, no longer snapping but simply watching her massive form navigate the cramped space. It happened on a Tuesday night. The temperature had plummeted violently, freezing the water bucket solid. Beatrice was asleep on her pallet near the dying fire. Caleb had insisted she take the warmest spot, while he and Samuel shared the rope bed in the freezing corner. A sound sliced through the dark. A sharp, ragged scream. Beatrice jolted awake, her heart hammering. The fire had died to glowing orange embers, casting writhing shadows across the logs. Another scream followed, frantic and breathless. She struggled upright, fighting the heavy wool blankets. On the bed, Samuel was thrashing violently, his small hands clawing at his throat. Caleb sat up beside him, completely frozen. The massive mountain man was paralyzed, his hands hovering over the boy, entirely devoid of instinct. "Sam," Caleb grunted, panic tight in his throat. "Boy, wake up." Samuel's eyes were squeezed shut, his face contorted in terror. He let out a high, thin wail, a sound of such helpless agony it felt like a knife dragging down Beatrice's spine. She didn't think. She shoved the blankets off. Her heavy body, usually a source of awkwardness and shame, felt suddenly like an anchor. She crossed the freezing dirt floor in 3 long strides. "Move," she snapped. Caleb flinched but scrambled back against the log wall. Beatrice sat on the edge of the mattress. The rope groaned, dipping heavily, forcing Samuel's thrashing body to roll toward her. She reached out with her thick, soft arms and hauled the boy into her chest. He fought her. His bony fists struck her collarbone, his knees kicking her thighs. She didn't let go. She wrapped her massive arms entirely around him, trapping his flailing limbs, pressing his head against the deep, soft cushion of her breasts. "Hush now," she murmured. Her voice was a deep, resonant rumble vibrating through her chest. "I've got you. The cold can't get you here. Hush." She rocked him, her heavy torso swaying back and forth, slow and inevitable. She smelled the sour sweat of his terror, felt the bird-like thud of his heart against her ribs. She didn't care about the dirt on his skin. She didn't care that he belonged to another woman. Slowly, the thrashing stopped. Samuel's ragged breathing hitched, then leveled out. His hands uncurled, his fingers digging into the fabric of her worn nightgown. He buried his face deeper into the warm fold of her neck. "Mama," he breathed, a tiny, broken exhale against her skin. A hot, stinging tear slipped down Beatrice's cheek, dropping silently onto his matted hair. She tightened her arms. "I'm here," she whispered. She stayed like that until the cold bit at her bare shoulders and the boy went entirely limp in dreamless sleep. When she opened her eyes, Caleb was watching her. He was still pressed against the wall. The pale moonlight filtering through the icy window caught the jagged scar over his eye. He stared at her with an expression she had never seen before. It wasn't the assessing gaze from the station. It was raw, naked reverence. He crawled slowly across the mattress until he was kneeling in front of her. The mattress sagged, pitching them closer. He smelled of pine needles and clean, cold sweat. He reached out. His calloused hand, scarred from knives and animal teeth, gently came to rest on her shoulder. His fingers were searingly hot against her chilled skin. He slid his hand down, his rough palm catching on her cotton gown, tracing the thick, heavy curve of her upper arm. It was a firm, grounding pressure. "I was wrong," Caleb said, his voice barely a hoarse whisper. Beatrice looked at him, her breath hitching. "About what?" At the station, Caleb's thumb stroked the soft, fleshy underside of her arm. He didn't pull away from her size. He leaned into it. He looked at Samuel, tucked safely into her warmth, and then back up to her wide, tear-streaked face. "I thought you were soft. I thought the mountain would break you." He leaned closer, the heat of his body radiating against her shivering skin. "It takes a lot of weight to anchor a cabin in a storm," he murmured, his ice-blue eyes burning with dark intensity. "You ain't soft, Beatrice. You're the strongest damn thing in this room." He simply rested his forehead against hers, his rough beard scratching her cheek, his large hand gripping her thick arm like a lifeline. For the first time in her 28 years, Beatrice didn't wish she was smaller, holding a feral boy against her chest while a brutal mountain man anchored himself to her warmth. She finally felt exactly the right size. Did Beatrice's raw grit change your perspective on what makes a true Western survivor? If this grounded, unapologetic romance struck a chord, don't scroll past. Hit that like button, share this story with someone who loves a deeply human drama, and subscribe to the channel for more untamed, emotional frontier tales. Drop a comment below. Did Caleb redeem himself? Or does he still have a long way to go? We want to hear your thoughts.